O nga hung benzagura pema CD hung. O nga hung benzagura pema CD hung. Welcome to my second last Dharma talk here at the Buddhist Center as we are finishing up our discussion of the long suttas of the Majjhima Nikaya, which we are pursuing as a supplement to the recently completed series of talks that took 34 weeks on the Digha Nikaya. So as most of you are aware, I'm sure by this point, we have been discussing the long suttas of the Majjhima Nikaya, the suttas that are at least as long as the average length of the suttas. Mahasakuludayi Sutta, the greater discourse to Sakuludayi, also called, he's also called just Udalian rather, in the sutta. This is quite an interesting sutta. It's interesting that it's coming up at the conclusion of our series of talks because it both incorporates many themes that we've learned about in our previous talks, both on the Digha Nikaya and other things, as well as introducing some new information, particularly a discussion of the Kasina meditations, which one finds in the Theravada and is quite interesting, and I believe it's the first reference in our series of talks to the Kasinas. I'm pretty sure they didn't come up in the Digha. It's possible they came up earlier in the Majjhima Nikaya in one of the suttas that we have not been discussing. And as if you're a member of Dharma by the Dharma to the West, my Dharma to the West group, this will also be my second last talk here at the Buddha Center, at least in the regular weekly schedule. I'm not able to maintain this schedule any longer, so it's next week, or assuming I complete the final talk for the Majjhima Nikaya next week, or in the next couple of weeks, will be my final talk here at the Deer Park in the Buddha Center in the Sunday 2 o'clock slot. In any case, I will be giving Dharma talks on an occasional basis at Dharma by the River in the future, but I'm not sure exactly what the schedule for that will be. It will probably be irregular as things become available. So anyway, this talk, the I have a lot of difficulty pronouncing this one. The Mahasakuludayi Sutta is, as someone mentioned to me today, quite a transcendental sutta, and it's a pity we can't read. I hope at least some of you have read the sutta, because it does have some intricacies to it that probably, if you haven't read the sutta, are going to go over your head. And it's a pity we couldn't read the sutta in advance of the talk, but it's 16 pages long, so that alone would be a project in itself. So if you have any questions during the course of the talk, please feel free to ask. As always, don't feel you have to save your questions till the end. And we'll take questions afterward, and then we'll retire to Dharma by the River for continuing chat if anyone's interested in doing that. The location of this sutta is the Squirrels Sanctuary in the Bamboo Grove, located in or near Rajagaha, which is modern Rajgir in Magadha, which is in an Indian province now. I'm not sure what the name of the province is, but it's Rajgir is the location, in the northeast, of course, of India. The Buddha is frequently portrayed in the Pali Suttas as an early bird, waking up too early to go on alms round, as is the case here. In fact, there's also passages which imply that he's walking up and down very early, like 1, 2 o'clock in the morning, which suggests that he may have been an insomniac as well. Be that as it may, he goes to the Peacock's Sanctuary. Here a number of well-known wanderers were staying, including Sakuludayan. The Buddha addresses Sakuludayan as Udayan, which is the name that I'm going to use henceforth. Here we encounter another familiar motif, which we've seen in other suttas in the Digha Nikaya, of the wanderer surrounded by a noisy group of wanderers discussing and debating with each other in the early morning hours. For example, Sutta 76 of the Majjhima Nikaya, but we've also seen this in the Digha Nikaya. And the Buddha often went early in the morning before alms round to visit these groups, with which he seems to have been on largely familiar terms. Some of them were antipathetic to the Buddha, but many were sympathetic, and he would go to these groups and he would talk to them. So he was interested in doing that. So he didn't just keep to his own group. He did mix with the other samanas and discuss Dhamma with them. This must have been a common occurrence in the 5th century BC Northeast India, that is the gathering of groups of samanas in parks in the early morning hours, and it appears to have been imitated in the Tibetan monastic schools, where formal debates were also used as a pedagogical device. Often in the suttas, although it certainly is suggested that samanas were discussing philosophical issues, often it's also suggested that there's a lot of gossip going on as well. We get quite a vivid description of life at that time if you actually read the Pali Canon thoroughly. At the Buddha's approach, Udayan shushes the crowd of wanderers, which we've also seen in the context of other suttas as well. There's a lot of repetitive patterns in the suttas, of course, being based on oral tradition as they were, but of course there's also no reason to disbelieve the essential truth of these accounts. It's quite reasonable to suppose that these types of groups met and the Buddha mixed with them. Udayan welcomes the Buddha and deferentially sits beside him on a low stool, so he is one of those who is favorably disposed to the Buddha. Whereupon the Buddha asks what the topic of discussion was that he is interrupted, also a familiar motif that we've seen before. Deferring the Buddha's question, also a familiar motif that we've seen before, Udayan asks a question of his own, and we've seen this familiar trope in other suttas too. However, the content changes. The actual content of the discussion changes from sutta to sutta. Udayan tells the Buddha that they are discussing, or were discussing, the leaders of the sects of the time, including Purana Kassapa, Makali Gosala, Ajita Kesakambali, Pakuda Kachayana, Sanjaya Belataputta, Niganta Nataputta, who's all better known as Mahavira, and we recognize these names as the names of the leaders of the major sectarian philosophies of the time. I had a board up last time with the names and the names of the philosophies. And of course Gautama himself. And they were asking the question, who is honored, respected, revered, and venerated by his disciples? How many live in dependence on him? As a way of evaluating the value of a teacher's teachings by the size and quality of his sangha. And on the contrary, all of these sects are notorious for dissension, except that of Gautama. This is, of course, a biased account. This is the account of the Pali Canon of these schools, so of course it's going to be favorably biased towards Buddhism. We recognize in these names the major sectarian philosophies of the time. Amoralism, which was founded by Purana Kassapa. Fatalism, founded by Makali Gosala. Materialism, founded by Ajita Kesakambali. 1, 2, 3. Eternalism, founded by Pakuda Kachayana. Agnosticism, founded by Sanjaya Belataputta. Restraint, the Jain philosophy, founded by Niganta Nataputta, also known as, or better known as Mahavira. Jain, or Jain, I think is Jain is also how it's pronounced, possibly more correctly. And of course Buddhism itself, founded by Gautama. So these are the, what are they? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 major samana philosophies of the Buddha's time, counting Buddhism itself. The Buddha then asks Udayan to name 5 qualities for which the Buddha is honored and respected. A trope which we've also seen before. The Buddha clearly enjoys setting these sorts of didactic traps in which he undermines his interlocutor's assumptions by asking apparently innocuous but probing questions which actually lead the questioner away from his original premises. A bit of verbal tricksterism that the Buddha does like to engage in, according to this, at least based on the evidence of the suttas. So Dayan names 5 things. He names moderate eating, moderation in eating, indifference as to the quality of one's robe, indifference as to the quality of one's food, and indifference as to the location, and perhaps implicitly quality of one's abode, or resting place, and finally, seclusion. All of these are essentially ethical precepts. However, the Buddha says that they are all untrue, and proceeds to give examples to prove it. Somewhat controversially, one would think, and in fact, this intuition is going to be proved to be correct. For the Buddha is about to turn the tables on Dayan and his respect for the Buddha. Thus, the Buddha says that sometimes he eats the full contents of his alms bowl, or even more. He wears fine robes, sometimes. He doesn't say he always wears fine robes. All of these things are preceded by this qualification, sometimes. So sometimes he eats the full contents of his alms bowl, even more. Sometimes he wears fine robes. Sometimes he accepts invitations to eat fine foods, something that I pointed out somewhat prominently in my discussion of the Digha Nikaya. Sometimes he lives in gabled mansions, and sometimes, and one would say more than sometimes based on the evidence of the Pali Canon, pretty much always, almost all of the time, he is surrounded by an entourage, both monastic and sectarian, or secular, I should say. Let me just change that. Secular. And both male and female. Shockingly, remembering, based on my talk on the status of women in ancient India and the Pali tradition, the intense misogyny of Indian society at the time of the Buddha, much as it is today. This self-description is consistent with many passages that we find in the Pali Canon. So this is by no means, although it is unusual for the Buddha to call attention to it so explicitly, the facts that it's referring to are clearly documented in the Pali Canon. And in a future work, I will be collecting into groups these kinds of passages, into groups with similar implications as a basis for understanding the Pali Canon. The conclusion, the inevitable conclusion of the Buddha's statement is that the Buddha did not lead an ascetic lifestyle, contrary to, say, conservative Buddhist orthodoxy as represented, for example, by the Theravadas. He freely admits in this passage that there are many monastics who live more ascetic lives than he does. I'm reminded of the Buddha's decisive, or derisive rather, description of all of the ethical precepts and practices in the Brahmajala Sutta, the first sutta of the Sutta Pitaka, which was my first talk on the suttas of the Digha Nikaya, the first book of the Sutta Pitaka, which are now available in my book Conversations with the Buddha, available from Chroniker Press at www.chronikerpress.com. Sorry, just had to throw that in there. Rather, the Buddha says, then, honoring and respecting him for such qualities, the Dayan should praise him for the higher virtues, knowledge and vision, the higher wisdom, the Four Noble Truths, and the way to develop wholesome states. The difference between these qualities and the former ones is clear and is very much along the lines of similar statements that the Buddha has made elsewhere. The 5 qualities for which a Dayan would praise the Buddha are clearly external, one might say exoteric, superficial, even mechanical observances of the same sort that the Buddha criticizes in other suttas. The qualities for which he should be truly praised are, on the contrary, internal, profound, and profoundly mindful. Similarly, elsewhere, the Buddha states that the 3 higher trainings supersede the Vinaya. That's a passage, I believe it's in the Digha Nikaya. I think we discussed it in my series of talks. And in addition, in the Brahmajala Sutta, the Buddha says that Tathagata should be praised for his wisdom, not for his practice of morality. Thus, The Buddha declares that he possesses the supreme aggregates of virtue and wisdom, direct knowledge or gnosis, the truths concerning suffering or angst, and the way to develop wholesome states consisting of mindfulness, striving, spiritual power, transcendence, the kasinas, which we'll get to soon, the spiritual faculties, the powers, the factors of enlightenment, the path, the liberations, the jhanas, or ecstasies, as I translate that word, the insight rather, the mental body, paranormal powers, clairaudience, telepathy, memory of past lives, clairvoyance, and finally the destruction of the taints, the latter synonymous with emancipation. These 19 components of the way to develop wholesome states constitute a classification of the Buddhist path, more extensive than the Noble Eightfold Path, wherein the Noble Eightfold Path is merely one component or part. The 19 components each seem to be independently capable of leading to consummate and perfect gnosis, since each one ends with a repetition of the statement that, quote, "Thereby many disciples of mine abide, having reached the consummation and perfection of direct knowledge." If one interprets this literally, and if one assumes that the translation is literally correct, the way this is constructed suggests that these are not just stepping stones, that each of these is a complete practice in itself which can lead to emancipation. But, as a note of caution perhaps, or a qualification, at the same time, we must admit that the sequence of these components represents a kind of development leading up to emancipation. So there's a little bit of an ambiguity there. It seems like there's a series of practices that can be practiced in sequence, but possibly each practice in and of itself is capable of leading to emancipation in its own right. We have encountered most of the components of this way to develop wholesome states in previous suttas, especially the 4 foundations of mindfulness, which we find in the Mahasakuludayi Sutta, the Noble Eightfold Path, of course, which one finds everywhere, the 4 jhanas, which we've already discussed several times in the context of the Digha Nikaya, the recollection of past lives, which is, despite the Buddha's reservation with respect to psychic powers, the recollection of past lives is also found everywhere in the Pali Canon, and the destruction of the taints, emancipation itself. I'm assuming that by this point we don't need to explain any of these. However, I would like to discuss the 10 kasinas, since I believe that this is the first sutta in which these have come up as a topic. I've mentioned before how the Pali Canon really just glosses the Buddha Dharma. We think, it's 40 volumes long, for God's sake. It's not a short work. And yet, I worked it out. One of my talks, we worked out that the material that's preserved in the Pali Canon only represents about 5 hours of speech for each year that the Buddha actually taught. 5 hours, and the Buddha is presented as pretty much wandering and talking to people all of the time. So obviously, and this isn't just my idea. Richard Gombrich has said this too, that we see in the repetitive tropes of the Pali Canon, the repetitive situations filled with different content, and the way that lists and doctrines are simply itemized. These are really just keys, for which there must have been an even vaster oral tradition that was never preserved, partially preserved perhaps in the commentaries, with a great deal of editing, and hundreds of years later. And this is especially true of the practices or the exercises, which are often just alluded to. In fact, I don't know. Maybe there is some discussion of practice, but it's very, very concise. And the 10 kasinas are no exception. The Buddha simply refers to contemplating the earth, water, fire, air, blue, yellow, red, white, space, and consciousness kasinas, which are contemplated, quote, above, below, and across, undivided, and immeasurable. That's it. That's the description of the practice, at least as far as the sutta is concerned. The word kasina itself means whole or entire. Also has a secondary meaning, which I'm going to be mentioning shortly, so I won't mention it now. The kasinas seem to represent 10 cosmic elements of being. 4 elements, 4 colors, space, consciousness. Above, below, undivided, and immeasurable. By contemplating progressively more elemental and subtle states of being, the vibration level or frequency, for lack of a better word, I know it's new agey, but it's the best word I know of to explain the concept, which is clearly there. The vibration level or frequency of one's consciousness state adjusts to that level. Thus, one is able to induce progressively subtle levels of meditation by means of the kasina meditation, which also develops the mental power of concentration or willpower. Like the 4 roads to power, which we discussed in the context of the Digha Nikaya, which appear in this list as the 4 bases of spiritual power, consisting of zeal, energy, mind, investigation. The kasina meditation has a tantric flavor, or proto-tantric, to use the term I used through my series of talks on the Digha Nikaya. It has a proto-tantric flavor, inasmuch as it emphasizes visualization and concentration very much like some admittedly more complex later tantric practices associated with mandalas. Visualization is a very powerful technique which is intimately associated with Tantra. The kasinas seem to be similar to the tattvas of Hindu tantric tradition, which also entered the Western esoteric tradition through the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Thus, it is widely regarded with some suspicion as edgy or potentially dangerous, even though it was clearly recommended by the Buddha. And to see, you can watch, for example, Ajahn Sudhiro's YouTube video called Benefits and Dangers of Kasina Meditation and the Bhavana Society of West Virginia. I don't know the name of the teacher who appears in the video, but clearly seems like a Thai teacher. But the group is called the Bhavana Society of West Virginia. They have a video called The Dangers of Kasina Meditation, and I'm sure those examples could be multiplied if you took the time to search for them on the internet. So there's those 2 references if you're interested in learning a bit more about kasina meditation from a somewhat reserved perspective. Surprising perspective, actually. The second teacher says he does not actually recommend kasina meditation, which is surprising, considering that it is in the suttas. And he's a Theravadan teacher, at least appears to be. The kasina system of meditation is described in the Visuddhimagga, written by Buddhaghosa about 830 years after the Buddha's passing on. That's 830 years after the Buddha's passing on, or parinibbana, compared to the Sutta, which is written down about 300 years later. 3 to 4, 350, say, in round numbers. All that the Sutta says is that, quote, one contemplates the kasina above, below, and across, undivided and immeasurable. And thereby many disciples of mine abide, having reached the perfection and consummation of direct knowledge, unquote. The method as taught today in the Theravada tradition involves focusing the attention on a representation of the element, such as a clay disc for earth. Over time, one develops an eidetic image in the mind. Anyone here need an explanation of the word eidetic? It's some people have the faculty of eidetic imagery naturally, but it can also be cultivated. It's the capacity to formulate a stable three-dimensional representation of an object in the mind. Something like a hologram, really, but in the mind. Which then becomes the object of concentration. So one discards the physical support and one simply concentrates on the image. And I will put it in the chat as you've requested. There's a book on eidetic imagery by a psychologist who's developed a system of psychotherapy around the capacity for eidetic imagery called Psyche, which, if you're interested in learning more about eidetic imagery, you can read. perhaps not an easy book to find. I have it. I picked it up some time ago. Let's see. So this is similar to how an unnamed monastic visited the Deva realms in Sutta 11 of the Digha Nikaya, if you recall. He created, by the force of his concentration, he created a vortex through which he was able to pass and have an experience of the Deva worlds. Very similar to the technique of astral projection as taught, for example, in the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. This requires great mental concentration as well as involving the visualization faculty of the brain, which we now know stimulates the right or latent hemisphere of the brain associated with mystical experiences. We know that the brain processes images very differently from verbal or textual information, and that they encode information much more efficiently than text. So you can remember a whole block of text simply by associating with an image and recalling the image to mind. You can train the mind, the brain, to do this. And this is how ancient and medieval memory systems worked, called the method of loci, or memory or mind palace. Visualization is, as I said, also one of the core techniques of Tantra. And on the topic of the kasinas, there is an interesting video. I mentioned this person before, the Venerable Metiko or Metiko. I'm not sure how it's pronounced. I mentioned him in the connection with the Digha Nikaya talks. He has a very interesting video called Ghost Story, in which he had a psychic experience, in which he communicated with a deva in the form of a snake, a viper, in his cave. An actual snake, I should point out. And here he's talking about kasina meditation. We're not going to break to listen to that video now because it's a little too short, not quite interesting enough to do that. But it is interesting and worth worth watching. It's only 2 minutes 25 seconds, I think, and it is on the blog. Available. This talk is available at www.palisuttas.com. It's should have appeared by now. I have it scheduled to publish at 5 o'clock Eastern Time, 2 o'clock Second Life Time. So it should be there now, and if you want to go and click it and watch it after the talk, then I would encourage you to do so. So the way to develop wholesome states, which we mentioned has 19 components. I'm going to go through the components and comment on some of them. Some a little more, I'll comment a little more, some a little less. Some of them you're going to be familiar with from previous talks that we've had, and those ones I will be not going into in much detail. So the first, whatever you want to call it, the first part, the first element, the first component of the way to develop wholesome states are the 4 foundations of mindfulness, consisting of body, feelings, mind, and mind objects. And of course, we've discussed that in the context of the Mahasakuludayi Sutta in the Digha Nikaya. Next is the four right kinds of striving: non-arising of unarisen evil states, abandoning of arisen evil states, arising of unarisen wholesome states, and continuance of unarisen wholesome states. I think these are fairly self-evident, don't require any commentary on my part. Third, the 4 bases for spiritual power, consisting of zeal, energy, purity of mind, or simply mind, and investigation. And these are identical with the 4 roads to power that appear in several suttas in the Digha Nikaya, and which is one of those practices which I identified as proto-tantric because of the preoccupation with power, the development of psychic powers, and the prolongation of life or longevity, all of which are typically tantric types of concerns. But we find this in the canonical suttas of the Pali Canon. Next, the 5 faculties: faith, energy, concentration, and wisdom, followed by the 5 powers: faith, energy, mindfulness, concentration, and wisdom. So note that the 5 powers consist of the 5 faculties plus mindfulness, or as I prefer to translate it, attention, sati. The 7 enlightenment factors: mindfulness, investigation of states, energy, rapture, tranquility, concentration, equanimity, the Noble Eightfold Path. I trust that this doesn't need any explanation for anyone. Right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration, which we've also discussed at length in my series of talks on the Digha Nikaya. The 8 liberations. 1. Possessed of material form, one sees forms. 2. Not perceiving forms internally, one sees forms externally. 3. One is resolved only upon the beautiful. 4. Space is infinite. 5. Consciousness is infinite. 6. There is nothing. 7. The base of neither perception nor non-perception. That is the realization of that. And 8. The cessation of perception and feeling. Note the similarity of the 8 liberations to the 8 jhanas, which of course the second set of 4 jhanas, the foremost jhanas, correspond to the realms, the corresponding realms of infinite space, infinite consciousness, nothingness, and neither perception nor non-perception. In this list, we've got 3 things. Possessed of material form, one sees forms. Not perceiving forms internally, one sees forms externally, and one is resolved only upon the beautiful. These 3 seem to correlate to the first 4 jhanas, and then the next 4 seem to correlate to the higher 4 foremost jhanas, interestingly. So this is a variation. One does find in the Pali Canon variations of similar structures, which also is something I'm interested in, bringing all these passages together, so we can see underlying these structures that there's a process of development that's still apparent in the Pali Suttas. The 8 bases for transcendence, the 8 bases for transcendence. Perceiving form internally, one sees form externally limited. Perceiving form internally, one sees form externally immeasurable. Not perceiving forms internally, one sees forms externally limited. Not perceiving forms internally, one sees forms externally immeasurable. Not perceiving forms internally, one sees forms externally blue. Not perceiving forms internally, one sees forms externally yellow. Next, not perceiving forms internally, one sees forms externally as red, and finally as white. Note the similarity of the reference to blue, yellow, red, and white corresponds to the 5th through 8 kasinas that appear in the next list. So the 10 kasinas: earth, water, fire, air, blue, yellow, red, white, space, and consciousness, which of course we've just been discussing. Compare the Hindu tattvas: spirit, air, fire, water, and earth, represented by a black oval, a blue circle, a red triangle, a white moon, and a yellow square, respectively. Next, the 4 jhanas. We're all familiar with those from our talks in the Digha Nikaya, which boil down to seclusion, concentration, rapture, and, in this sutta, pure bright mind. Note the similarity of the typification of the 4th jhana in the sutta as pure bright mind to the Mahayana concept of the Buddha nature or clear light doctrines. This association of the 4th jhana with pure bright mind is not found in the Digha Nikaya, as far as I can tell, where the 4th jhana is simply associated with equanimity and mindfulness. But it definitely is in the Majjhima Nikaya, and one can certainly see the relationship between the Pali concept of pure bright mind and the Mahayana concept of clear light, which in turn correlates to the Tathagata Garbha doctrine, or Buddha nature or Buddha embryo. Insight knowledge, which is not a list of practices, but rather more, well, it's a practice, the cultivation of insight. The meaning seems to be that the 4 great elements are represented by blue, yellow, red, and white threads, like the colors of the kasinas. And one finds, this is the metaphor that one also finds in the Digha Nikaya of the beryl stone strung on 4 different colored, or a thread of 4 different colors, which one also finds in the Digha Nikaya. So, and I can read it actually, that just in case people didn't read the Sutta. I will actually read the text that correlates to that because it's an interesting metaphor. So let me just find it. Insight knowledge. So let me just read this to you. It's easier than trying to explain it. Again, Udayan, I have proclaimed to my disciples the way to understand thus. This body of mine, made of material form, consisting of the four great elements, procreated by a mother and father and built up out of boiled rice and porridge. You can almost hear the Buddha's lip curling in contempt at his description of the body, is subject to impermanence, to being worn and rubbed away, to dissolution and disintegration, and this consciousness of mine is supported by it and bound up with it. Suppose there were a beautiful beryl gem, beryl or beryl, I think, beryl gem of purest water, 8-faceted, well-cut, clear and limpid, possessed of all good qualities, and through it a blue, yellow, red, white, or brown thread would be strung. Then a man with good sight, taking it in his hand, might review it thus. This is a beautiful beryl gem of purest water, 8-faceted, well-cut, clear and limpid, possessed of all good qualities, and through it is strung a blue, yellow, red, white, or brown thread. So too I have proclaimed to my disciples the way to understand thus. This body of mine is subject to impermanence, to being worn and rubbed away, to dissolution and disintegration, and this consciousness of mine is supported by it and bound up with it. And therefore many disciples of mine abide, having reached the consummation and perfection of direct knowledge. So the meaning seems to be that the four great elements are represented by blue, yellow, red, and white threads, the colors of the kasinas. The body, made up out of the same four elements, is like the threads, on which is strung a beautiful 8-faceted beryl gem of purest water, well cut, clear, and limpid, possessed of all good, representing consciousness. Thus, consciousness is supported by and bound up with the body without being identical with it. Similarly, in his statement on the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama states that, quote, things are preceded by things of a similar type. Thus, unquote. Thus, mental and physical causes result in effects of the same kind. Thus, physical causes produce material effects and mental causes create psychological effects. The body may obstruct the manifestation of consciousness, but the body, essentially unconscious and inanimate, cannot be its cause. Therefore, consciousness and body are distinct but commingled. And I see in this description a little bit of confusion about the colors. Blue, yellow, red, white, or brown. Oh, I see, okay. So blue, yellow, red, they all match except for brown, which probably corresponds to Earth. So I still think it's quite a close match to the kasinas. And it's in the same list. So to me, that's what the implications of that somewhat obscure metaphor are. Next, the mind-made body, something which many Buddhists, many religious Buddhists are surprised by, that the Buddha actually explicitly taught a doctrine of what we simply call astral projection. Similarly, the mental body is generated by the psychosomatic complex, like pulling a reed from its sheath, to use the metaphor of the Buddha, a sword from its scabbard, or a snake from its slough. And this is a distinct physical experience, as I can tell you. We know from other suttas that the way to create the mental body to which the Buddha alludes, he doesn't actually describe the technique here. Again, confirming my assertion that the practices are often referred to in very summary form. But elsewhere he does say that the projection of the mental body, or the generation of the mental body, is a characteristic of, or a power, if you like, of someone who has attained the fourth jhana. The kinds of supernormal power: self-multiplication, invisibility, passing through matter, levitation, the so-called physical paranormal powers, which a lot of discussion about this. We've encountered these before, of course, where I've noted the similarity of these powers to powers exhibited in three contexts that are known to us, because these powers are not typically or commonly part of our experience, but in fact they are in three specific contexts. And these are dreaming, the psychedelic experience, and also the UFO experience, which is related to the larger category of paranormal experiences in general. And although rare, these are experienced. About 5% of the population have seen a UFO. Half of these, or 2.5%, were contact experiences, whereas about 20% have had some sort of paranormal experience. The divine ear element. This is commonly termed clairaudience and includes hearing both divine and human sounds, both far and near, which makes it a psychic power. Because of the capacity to hear sounds from farther away than one normally would be able to. Understanding the minds of others. The description doesn't quite rise to the level of telepathy as we typically understand the concept, since only broad mental states are intuited. But although the Buddha certainly is represented in different places in the Pali Canon as being aware of the contents of the thoughts of other people, as are the Devas, but it does come. But in this concept, it comes close, including the ability to recognize minds that are liberated and not liberated. And this is, of course, also the power of a Buddha. And I should mention earlier, also in connection with the fourth jhana that I just mentioned, both in the context of the clear light association and in the context of the generation of the mental body, the generation of the mental body. The attainment of the fourth jhana is also essentially equated with arhatship. Argus Portal says a sort of super empathy, yes. Or simply a broad form of telepathy. Sort of, but it is sort of like, I'm thinking of that Counselor Troy in Star Trek, with her, who's an empath, not a telepath. So yes, exactly that kind of distinction. But nowhere is the reality of telepathy denied either. Especially for higher dimensional beings who can see into the minds of lower dimensional beings, just as beings of higher dimension, a fourth dimensional being, for example, would be able to see inside a sealed container, or a container that's sealed in the third dimension, and therefore the contents of it are invisible to someone in the fourth dimension. It would be an open box. So it could be a function of dimensionality as well, which is interesting in the context of the whole UFO question. The recollection of past lives. Note the cosmological reference to eons of world contraction and expansion. Richard Gombrich has noted that the recollection of past lives is paradoxical. Jospe says, I thought there were more lines in the suttas where the Buddha picks up when one's thoughts change. Yes, there are. There are others where the Buddha clearly perceives the thoughts of others. But in this sutta, it isn't that clear. This sutta only talks about having a broad understanding of other people's mental states, not necessarily their specific thoughts, from which one can then weave all sorts, any theory one wants out of that fact, but that's the fact. It's sort of in between. Empathy, telepathy, it's sort of a little bit of each. So a little bit more than empathy, a little bit less than telepathy. So Richard Gombrich has noted that the recollection of past lives is paradoxical. He's noted it without exploring the implications, however, as I am. Since samsara has no beginning, which is absolutely canonical, therefore one's past lives would be infinite, would they not? But since memory is finite, how can one remember all of one's past lives? And yet this is stated to be a characteristic or quality of Buddhahood. The divine eye The divine eye confers the capacity to discern the karmic patterns of cause and effect, including the state of other individuals' rebirths, and this is also a characteristic of Buddhahood. The destruction of the taints. Note that the Mahasakuludayi Sutta represents the destruction of the taints, in which mind becomes like a clear, limpid, and undisturbed lake. Again, bringing to mind the pure, bright mind, typification of the fourth jhana. As a practice, a technique, or an exercise, rather than as the goal or result of the way, corresponding presumably to a mode of meditation. If you look at the structure of the sutta, it's ending. Each of these techniques ends with the same statement that by this means one can achieve Buddhahood. Which is the basis of my earlier assertion that it seems that each of these ways can be practiced as a complete yoga in its own right. Certainly some of them can. Certainly the 5 foundations of mindfulness are presented that way. Mindfulness of the breathing is presented that way. It can carry one all the way to Tathagatahood. But some of these other things, that's a less common assertion. And certainly it's unusual for the cessation of perception itself, the destruction of the taints here, but the cessation of perception itself to be presented as a way, rather suggesting to me something like the path of Dzogchen, which takes the goal of the way as the path. So according to the postscript, Udayan was satisfied and delighted in the Blessed One's words, but there was no indication, interestingly, that he converted. And that's it. That's today's talk. Wow, it went 47 minutes. That's good. Thank you very much for this opportunity once again to discuss Dharma. It is my pleasure and privilege. I'm happy to take any questions at this point before we conclude with the dedication of merit. And then I will be returning to Dharma by the River. If anyone would like to join me to carry on the chat in an informal way in local chat, you're welcome to do so. So at this point, does anyone have any comments or questions about today's topic? Nice northern lights in the background. I'll give you a minute or 30 seconds or so. If you feel you need more than 30 seconds, just put something in the chat so we know you're typing. I'll be returning next Sunday for the final talk. It's 88, I think, 88, 85. Let me just see. I'll just tell you just so you know. So you don't have to look it up yourself. Oh, where is it? It's 82. It's the Ratapala Sutta, Jimandakaya Sutta 82. Our guest Portal says, will you continue someday your teachings? I'm not able, my work situation has just become nightmarish since I became unemployed in March. And in January, I'm having to increase my hours to 44 hours a week. I'll be working 5 to 10 Monday through Friday and 10 to 4 Saturday and Sunday. So my available time, my ability to create a talk on a weekly basis is just I don't have the time to do it any longer. And I have my own study to do, which is I have to continue or else there won't be. The talks will have no source. So I am planning to continue to give talks on an intermittent and occasional basis, but not on a weekly basis. And since I can't commit to a weekly schedule, I'm having to withdraw from Buddha Center because they like to be able to have a posted schedule. So I will be teaching at Dharma by the River on an occasional basis. I'll simply throw up notices. Maybe I'll give a few days notice when I have a talk ready, and I'm very eager to give my talk on UFOs and Buddhism. And I am continuing to read the Pali Canon. I've only completed 1 year of the 5. It's in Yarmouth, and if you use the map and go to Yarmouth, you will rest on this road right in front of the entrance to the Dharma Center. So that's actually easier than a landmark. But if you want a landmark, I can also send you one. And I also have these talks available on note card as well. So anyone who would like a copy of today's talk on note card, please send me a request, and it will be in the bookcase in the Dharma Center, along with all the other note cards as well. So that's what I'm going to do. The 3 books I've written so far, the 3 major books, I'm revising Dharma notes, and I've almost completed. I haven't revised it for 2 years because I just haven't had the time, and now I do, and it's almost a new book. So if any of you have bought previous edition of Dharma Notes, you might want to pick up the 4th edition, which should be ready by the end of the year. Right now I've taken it off the internet, so it's not available currently, but it should be available again in approximately 2 or 3 weeks. And it's practically a new book. So those 3 books, The Fundamental View, Conversations with the Buddha, and Dharma Chats, have all really come out of my first year of my vow to read the Pali Canon through 5 times. I've only been at it for about a year, and I have 4 years to go. So hopefully I'll be doing more talks on the Pali Canon, and more, not just talks, but written materials. One of the things I want to do is bring together all of references to common topics from wherever they occur in the Pali Canon, bring all the relevant texts together into one place, and then explore each topic from a synthetic perspective. That's one of the things I want to do. So I might be doing a series of talks on topics rather than texts. Okay, it seems no. Anyone have any more questions before we conclude? Okay, then let's continue with the dedication of merit, whereby we dedicate the merit of this talk to all beings. Whatever understanding, whatever positive force has come from this, may it go deeper and deeper and act as a cause to reach enlightenment for the benefit of all. Thank you very much for this opportunity to present Dharma. It is my pleasure and privilege, as always. I will return for my final talk here at the Buddha Center next Sunday at 2 o'clock, hopefully, if I get the talk written in time. And please feel free to join me in Yarmouth at Dharma by the River if any of you are interested. Namaskar.